It was late November of 2017 when I decided to drive out to a small hunting cabin my uncle used to own, tucked deep in the woods of northern Montana. I hadn't been there in years. After he passed, no one really went back. Too far, too isolated, too much work to keep it in shape. But I wanted quiet, somewhere away from people, somewhere I could just think. I'd taken a week off work, packed my old rifle, a small cooler of food, and my dog, Cooper. The plan was to hunt a few days, maybe fix up the place a bit, and then head home before the snow got too heavy. The drive out there was long. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the overgrown trees. It twisted and climbed, the forest closing in on both sides. There was no phone signal the moment I turned off the main road. The air felt heavy, still. Cooper stayed quiet in the passenger seat, watching the trees pass by with his ears pinned back. The sun was already dropping by the time I saw the cabin through the branches. A dark, slanted roof poking out from behind a line of spruce trees. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was weathered gray, the porch sagging slightly on one corner. The old metal chimney was bent, probably from a storm or a fallen branch. I parked a few yards away, grabbed my pack, and stepped out. The air was cold enough that my breath came out white. There was that smell of wet pine and soil, mixed with something faintly metallic. Cooper sniffed around the porch, his tail low but wagging slightly. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered everything. The old wooden table was still there, with a few rusted tools lying on top. The bed frame leaned against the wall, mattress gone flat and stained. I set my gear down, swept the place out, and lit the small propane lantern I'd brought. The yellow light filled the space slowly, making the corners seem deeper. That night, I built a fire in the small stone fireplace. The wood hissed and cracked, the smell filling the cabin. Cooper lay near the door, eyes half open. I sat on the floor, eating from a can of beans, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. It was quiet, except for the fire and the occasional creak from the cabin settling. The next morning, I hiked out early. The forest was thick with frost, every step crunching under my boots. I followed an old trail that led downhill toward a clearing where deer usually passed. The silence of the woods was heavy. No birds, no wind, just that dull hum of distant trees rubbing in the cold. I stayed out for hours, but saw nothing. When I finally turned back, the sky was already going pale gray. That evening, I noticed something strange near the cabin. About 30 yards away, near the tree line, I found boot tracks. Not mine. The prints were deep, fresh, maybe a few hours old. They came from the woods, stopped near the cabin, then went back the same way. The ground was hard from the frost, but you could still see the shape of the heel and toe. Cooper sniffed them for a long time, then started whining softly. I told myself it was probably some hunter passing through, maybe someone checking on land or looking for game. Still, the prints bothered me. There was something about how they stopped, right in front of the cabin, like whoever made them had stood there for a while, just looking. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lantern burning low and the rifle propped near the bed. I could hear small noises outside, the wind pushing through branches, something light moving across the porch, maybe an animal. Cooper growled once, low and long, his head lifting toward the door. I stayed still, listening. The sound came again, faint, wood creaking, slow, careful. Then it stopped. When I went out in the morning, there were no new tracks, just the old ones half frozen from the cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been there. I decided to stay close that day, chopping some firewood and fixing a few boards around the windows. Every now and then I'd stop and look toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. But the forest stayed still. By the third day, the weather started turning. The clouds thickened, and a light snow began to fall by noon. I went out again to check the traps I'd set near a small creek down the hill. The walk was quiet. The snow muted everything. The crunch of my boots, even the sound of the creek. When I reached the traps, I found one of them missing. Not broken, just gone. The chain that held it was cut clean through. It didn't make sense. I looked around for signs of animals, but there were no tracks, no drag marks, nothing. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open, just slightly, a few inches. I knew I had closed it that morning. Cooper wouldn't have done it. He'd been with me the whole time. I stepped closer, gun raised, heart thudding. Inside, the fire was still going low, the air warm. Nothing seemed moved. No footprints on the floor. Still, the latch on the door looked like it had been forced from the outside. Small splinters around the edge. I stayed awake most of that night, the rifle across my lap. The snow outside kept falling, heavy now, covering everything in a thick white layer. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, moving around the cabin. Cooper was up instantly, silent but tense, his ears flat and eyes locked on the door. The sound circled once, then stopped. The fire popped loudly, and I froze. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, there were tracks again. Same boots as before, circling the cabin this time. They led into the woods, disappearing deeper than I could see. I followed them a few hundred yards, but the snow was too deep and visibility was low. I turned back. By the fifth day, I'd had enough. The food was low, and the snow wasn't letting up. I decided to pack up and leave before I got snowed in completely. I loaded the truck early, Cooper pacing by the door. As I was tying down the last of my gear, I noticed something near the side of the cabin. A small pile of bones. Clean, white, small. Looked like from a rabbit or something similar. They were laid neatly, almost arranged in a circle. That stopped me cold. I didn't bother checking anything else. I just got in the truck and started driving. The tires slipped in the snow, but I kept going, following the narrow track down the hill until the cabin disappeared from view. The whole time I felt watched. Not the kind of feeling you can explain, it was just there, heavy, following behind every turn. When I finally reached the main road and got signal again, I stopped to check my phone. I had a few missed calls from a friend and one from the local ranger's office. The voicemail from the ranger made my stomach drop. He said they'd been tracking a man in the area for the last few days, a poacher who'd been breaking into remote cabins and hunting illegally. He'd been reported seen not far from where I was staying. They'd found one of his campsites, empty, except for some bones and a set of animal traps. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. A few months later, in the spring, I got a call from a relative who went up there to check on the place. He told me someone had broken in again. Windows smashed, doors ripped off the hinges. They found old food cans, a burned spot in the middle of the floor, and tracks leading into the woods behind the cabin. The sheriff said whoever it was had probably been living out there for weeks, maybe longer. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, the sounds around the cabin, the footprints, the cut trap, I still wonder how close he really was. Maybe he'd been watching the whole time. Maybe he'd waited until I left. The thought that I'd spent nights there, sleeping only feet away from someone who'd been circling me in the dark, never really leaves me. That cabin's still up there somewhere, half buried in the snow, quiet and rotting. But I'll never go back. Not because I'm scared of ghosts or curses or anything like that. Just because I know now that the most dangerous thing out there isn't the forest or the cold or the dark. It's whoever might be standing just outside your light, waiting for you to fall asleep. It was late October of 2014 when I drove out to my uncle's old property in northern Wisconsin. The place had been abandoned for almost 8 years, sitting on 50 acres of overgrown farmland with a small wooden cabin at the edge of the tree line. My uncle had passed away years ago, and the property sat untouched since then. I decided to spend a few days there alone to clear my head after quitting my job in Minneapolis. I figured it'd be quiet, just me, the woods, and the cold air. The drive there took most of the afternoon. The dirt road leading to the cabin had almost disappeared, covered with weeds and fallen leaves. I had to slow down to avoid scraping the bottom of my truck. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked worse than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly, the windows were coated in dust, and the wooden boards had darkened with rot and rain. Behind it, the remains of the barn leaned sideways, half collapsed under its own weight. I parked near the front steps and just sat there for a while. There was a stillness to that place I hadn't felt in years. No distant engines, no passing cars. Just the soft hum of wind moving through tall grass and a few crows somewhere off in the trees. The air smelled damp and earthy, the way it always does before snow season starts. When I finally went inside, the air was stale. The wood floors creaked with every step, and there was a fine layer of dust on everything, the table, the counters, the window frames. I opened the back door to let in some air, then went room to room, checking for signs of animals or leaks. There were some old mouse droppings near the baseboards and a few cobwebs in the corners, but nothing major. The cabin had one small bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a single bathroom with a cracked sink, and a tiny living area with a rusted wood stove in the corner. By evening, I got a fire going. I cooked a can of soup on a portable stove and sat at the table, watching the light fade through the windows. As darkness came, the woods outside seemed to swallow the clearing completely. There were no lights for miles around. Once the fire burned low, the only sound left was the faint ticking of the stove metal cooling off. That night, I slept lightly. The bed creaked under my weight and the cold air leaked through the cracks in the window frame. At some point, I woke up to a sound outside, something moving slowly in the dry grass. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I held still and listened. The noise stopped for a while, then picked up again, heavier this time. Probably a deer or a raccoon, I thought. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep after that. The sound of the woods always felt louder when you were the only person around. In the morning, I went out to look around the property. The fields were long gone, just tall weeds and dry stalks bending in the wind. The barn looked worse up close. The doors had fallen off, and inside was a mess of old tools, broken boards, and animal nests. Near the back wall was a rusted red tractor with flat tires and vines crawling through its seat. I took a few pictures with my phone, thinking I might fix it up one day. As I walked the edge of the field, I noticed a section of the ground that looked disturbed. The soil was darker, as if it had been dug up recently. I crouched down and saw what looked like part of a tire track, half faded. I didn't remember any vehicles being out here in years, and no one else had access to the property. The gate was chained when I arrived. I didn't think much of it then, but the thought stuck in my head for the rest of the day. That evening, clouds rolled in and the air turned colder. I made a small fire outside and sat watching it burn. The woods behind the cabin were quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just wind. I thought I saw movement once, deep between the trees, but when I stared, there was nothing. The fire crackled and I heard the faint sound of metal clinking. I figured it was just something shifting in the barn. When I went to lock up for the night, I noticed the back door was open a few inches. I was sure I had closed it earlier. The latch didn't hold well, so maybe the wind pushed it open. I shut it tight, slid the old wooden bar across, and went to bed. Sometime past midnight, I woke again to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It was slower, like footsteps moving across the porch boards. The wood groaned softly under the weight. Then silence. My chest felt tight. I held my breath and listened, straining to catch any other noise. After a while, I heard the soft tap of something brushing against the cabin wall, just beneath the window. I stayed still for almost an hour, waiting, my hand gripping the flashlight beside me. I didn't move until I saw the faint gray of dawn through the window. When I finally went outside, there were fresh boot prints in the mud near the porch, larger than mine. They led from the woods toward the cabin, stopped near the window, then disappeared back the same way. I walked around, scanning the tree line. Whoever it was, they hadn't come from the road. The prints started too far from the clearing. I followed them for a few yards into the woods before losing them in the leaves. My stomach sank when I saw what looked like a cigarette but half buried near the trail, still faintly smelling of smoke. Couldn't have been there long. The rest of the day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't go far and I kept checking the woods. Every sound made me tense up. Around dusk, I stacked more wood by the door and double-checked the locks. I decided if anything happened again that night, I'd leave in the morning. When the darkness settled, I sat near the stove, listening to the fire pop and hiss. The wind outside had picked up, and every gust made the cabin creak. Sometime later, I heard that same sound again. Boots on the porch boards, slow and heavy. My heartbeat quickened. The fire was still glowing, and I didn't want whoever was out there to see the light. I covered the stove with the iron lid to dim it. The footsteps stopped. Then came a scraping noise, like metal dragging lightly across wood. I didn't move. I could hear breathing, faint but real, on the other side of the wall. It went on for several seconds, then faded away. I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching the flashlight, staring at the door. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. The prints were back. Fresh ones, deeper than before, circling the cabin this time. Something else caught my eye near the side wall. An old hatchet, half buried in the mud. I didn't own one. The handle was damp, but the blade had been wiped clean. That was enough for me. I packed everything into the truck and got ready to leave. Before driving off, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The air was still, and the field stretched empty all around, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. I started the engine and pulled down the dirt road, glancing in the mirror until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. About 2 miles down, I passed a narrow trail that led to an old fence line. I slowed as I noticed something near it. Tire marks, deep and fresh, leading into the woods. The same kind of tread I'd seen near the barn. I didn't stop. I just kept driving until I hit the main road. Later, when I got back home, I called the county office to ask if anyone had been working near that area, maybe hunters or utility crews. They said no one had permits out there that season. The property was still listed as private and inactive. I never went back after that. I sold the land a few months later for half of what it was worth, just to get rid of it. Sometimes, when I think about those nights, I wonder if whoever was out there had been watching the place for a while. Maybe they used that cabin before I came. Maybe they still do. All I know is that when I left, the air around that place didn't feel empty. It felt like I had interrupted something that wasn't meant to be seen. And somewhere in those woods behind that farm road, someone else still knows exactly where that cabin stands. It was late September of 2011 when I drove up to my grandfather's old cabin for the first time since his death. He had passed away the year before, and the cabin had been sitting untouched in the woods of northern Montana ever since. I was 34 then, working as a mechanic in a small town outside Great Falls, and I guess part of me wanted to get away from everything for a while. The cabin had been a place I remembered from my childhood. Quiet, tucked between thick pine trees, far enough from the nearest road that you could go days without hearing another human being. The drive there took nearly 4 hours, most of it through narrow dirt paths that hadn't been maintained in years. The rain had softened the ground, and mud splattered up against the sides of my truck as I crept up the slope. I remember how the air felt heavier the deeper I got into the forest, like the trees swallowed sound. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up to the clearing. The cabin stood crooked, the roof sagging on one side, the front steps warped and leaning. The windows were clouded from the inside with dust. It had been my grandfather's favorite place, but he was a rough man. Quiet, stubborn, never shared much about himself. He used to disappear up here for weeks, sometimes months, saying he needed to get away from people. As a kid, I didn't think much of it. But standing there again with the forest pressing in from all sides, I understood why he liked it. It was peaceful in a lonely sort of way. When I got inside, the air was stale, smelling of damp wood and something else. Something faintly metallic like rust. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Dust clung to every surface, and spiderwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling like thin curtains. The furniture was all still there, covered in a thin layer of grime. His old rocking chair sat by the window, facing the trees, like he'd just stepped out and would be back any minute. I spent most of that first hour airing the place out, opening the windows, sweeping the floor. The wind outside made the trees groan, and the sound echoed through the walls. I found his old lantern hanging on a nail by the door, still with a bit of oil left in it. When I lit it, the light flickered and threw long shadows across the room. By evening, the sky had turned dark gray, and it started to drizzle. I sat on the old couch, eating from a can of beans, listening to the rain tapping against the roof. The sound of water dripping through a crack somewhere in the ceiling kept steady time, a dull rhythm that made me uneasy for no reason I could name. Later, I decided to check the storage shed behind the cabin. My grandfather used to keep tools and firewood in there, and I figured I could use some to fix up the place a bit. The shed was small, just a few yards from the back door. The grass around it was knee-high, wet from the rain. When I pulled the door open, the hinges screamed. Inside, it was dark and colder than outside. I could smell damp soil, old gasoline, and something else underneath. A sharp, sour smell that made me step back for a moment. The shelves along the walls held rusted nails, empty jars, a few broken tools. In the corner, a tarp lay crumpled on the ground. It looked like it had been there for years, soaked through, covered in dust. I almost left it alone, but then curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a stick from the ground and lifted the edge of the tarp. What I saw underneath didn't make sense at first. It looked like old clothing, torn and stuck to something dark. When I pulled the tarp back farther, the smell hit me. Strong, thick, rotten. I dropped the stick and stepped back, covering my nose with my sleeve. There was a body under the tarp. What was left of one, anyway. The clothes were old flannel shirt, jeans, work boots, and the bones were yellowed, parts of them still wrapped in dried, leathery skin. I could see the outline of a skull, the hollow sockets staring up through the dark. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen. My stomach twisted, and my head started to ring. It looked like it had been there a long time, years, maybe decades. I stumbled back out of the shed into the rain. I leaned over and threw up beside the door. My hands were shaking, my shirt sticking to my skin from the rain. I remember thinking it had to be a hunter, maybe someone who got lost up here years ago. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The shed had a padlock on it when I was a kid. Only my grandfather had the key. I went back inside the cabin, pacing the floor, trying to think straight. I wanted to leave right then, but the rain had turned into a downpour, and the dirt road would have been nearly impossible to drive through in the dark. I told myself I'd stay the night, then go straight to the sheriff's office in the morning. The night felt endless. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, something shifting outside. Every sound made my chest tighten. I barely slept, sitting there in the dark with the lantern burning low, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I packed my things in silence. I went back to the shed once more, not sure why. Maybe I needed to be certain of what I saw. The rain had stopped, and the air was still, heavy with the smell of wet pine and decay. I crouched down near the tarp again, and this time I noticed something I hadn't before. A small metal tag half buried in the dirt near the bones. I brushed it off with my fingers. It was an old dog tag. The letters were faded, but I could still make out the name, Harold Meyer. My grandfather's name was Harold Meyer. I just stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. He'd been buried in town, in the cemetery near the church. I'd been at the funeral. I'd seen the coffin go into the ground. But the body in that shed, it was wearing his clothes. The same jacket he always wore. The same boots. It didn't make sense. Not any of it. I drove to the sheriff's office that day, told them what I found. They sent a deputy and a forensic team up to the cabin. A few days later, one of them called me. They said they confirmed the remains were my grandfather's. The coffin buried in the cemetery had been filled with sandbags and rocks. They told me it was an open investigation, that they'd try to find out who buried him there, how it happened, but the truth was no one ever did. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no blood anywhere else in the cabin. Whoever put him in that shed did it a long time ago, and they'd done it quietly. I didn't go back there after that. The cabin still stands, I think, though the forest has probably swallowed it by now. Sometimes, when I drive through the back roads near the mountains, I think about it. The way the air felt that day, the way the woods seemed to listen. I think about my grandfather and how little I ever really knew about him. All those years he spent up there alone, away from everyone. Whatever happened in that cabin stayed buried until I pulled back that tarp. And even now, after all this time, I can't decide which part is worse. The fact that someone killed him and hid him there, or the feeling deep down that maybe he went up there knowing exactly what was waiting for him. It was early November, the kind of month when the countryside in northern England feels half asleep, covered in a constant sheet of gray clouds and damp mist. I had rented an old wooden cabin near the edge of Northumberland for a week, planning to get away from work and noise. The place was far from anything. No nearby houses, no streetlights, just narrow roads covered in wet leaves and lined with black trees. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. I arrived late in the afternoon, just before the rain started, with a few bags, a small gas heater, and some food to last me through the week. The cabin was small but strong-looking. It stood at the end of a muddy trail surrounded by thick trees and sloping hills. The roof was patched in places, and there was an old metal chimney that leaned slightly. When I opened the door, the air smelled like old wood, dust, and something else, like damp fabric that had never fully dried. The floor creaked with every step, and the walls had marks and scratches, probably from years of moving furniture or animals brushing past. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel a little like home. I put my sleeping bag on the small bed, lit the heater, and watched the steam rise off my wet boots. It was quiet except for the rain hitting the roof. I had no phone signal, and the nearest town was about 15 miles away. It felt isolating but peaceful, at least for the first day. The first night went fine. I made tea, read for a bit, and fell asleep early. The wind outside was strong enough to make the cabin walls hum. I woke up a few times to branches hitting the windows, but nothing strange. It wasn't until the second evening that I started to notice something off. It was around 6. I was outside stacking a bit of firewood near the shed behind the cabin. The light was fading fast, and the air had that heavy, wet cold that seeps through your clothes. As I bent down to grab another log, I felt like someone was watching me. It wasn't the kind of thought that comes from paranoia. It was sharper, heavier, like being aware of someone's eyes on you. I straightened up slowly and looked around. The woods were still, quiet except for a crow somewhere in the distance. I saw nothing, but I couldn't shake it off. I went inside and locked the door, even though I hadn't locked it the night before. I told myself it was just because of the darkness and the sound of the wind. But as I was making dinner, I glanced out the small back window and saw something that made my stomach tighten. Far beyond the shed, near the tree line, there was a shape. Someone standing there. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was tall, thin, wearing something long and dark. Her face was hard to see because of the distance, but her posture was strange. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the open, looking toward the cabin. I froze. I stayed still for a while, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. I blinked a few times, and when I looked again, she was gone. My chest felt tight, but I didn't go outside. I pulled the curtains shut and turned up the heater. I barely ate my food that night. I tried to read again, but I couldn't focus on a single line. Every sound outside, every gust of wind, every scrape, felt too close, too real. The next morning, I checked the area around the shed. There were footprints in the mud, light, narrow ones. They weren't mine. They led from the edge of the trees toward the shed, then turned back the same way. My hands were shaking a little as I looked at them. It hadn't rained during the night, so they had to be fresh. The air felt heavy that whole day. I didn't go anywhere. I stayed inside and tried to ignore the creeping feeling that someone was nearby. Around noon, I saw something else. From the front window, through the thin mist, I spotted movement again near the trees. Just a flicker, a glimpse of that same long, dark shape. It was like she was circling the cabin, staying just far enough to be barely seen. By the third night, I was barely sleeping. I had pushed a chair against the door, even though it had a bolt. I kept the light on until early morning, staring at the window and listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a slow crunching of footsteps outside, close, moving past the side of the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps stopped near the back wall. I didn't move. Then there was this slow scraping sound, like something rough being dragged along the wall. I thought it might be a branch, but the sound was steady, controlled. It moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then stopped under the window. I didn't look, couldn't. I sat there for almost an hour, barely breathing, until the sound faded and the silence returned. When daylight came, I went outside again, even though I didn't want to. The ground near the window had deep footprints in the mud, the same narrow shape as before. And right under the window frame, there was a long mark in the wood, like someone had dragged a stick or a knife along it. I felt cold all over. I knew I had to leave, but my car was parked down the dirt trail half a mile away, because the cabin road was too muddy to drive up. I decided to pack up right then. As I was putting things into my bag, I glanced at the window one last time. She was there again, standing just beyond the shed, closer than before. Her hair looked tangled, her clothes wet and heavy. She didn't move, just stood there watching. I froze, holding my breath, then turned away, grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the trail. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, and the fog was thicker now. I could still feel that same pressure behind me, that awareness that she might still be standing there watching me go. When I reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before starting the engine. The drive out felt endless. Every bend in the road, every patch of mist. I expected to see her figure again by the trees or on the side of the road. I didn't. I drove straight until I reached the main road near the small town of Hexham, where I finally pulled over. My throat was dry, and my arms felt numb from gripping the steering wheel. I told myself it was just some local woman, maybe lost or wandering, maybe even living in the woods. But deep down, I knew there was something else about her, something deliberate. She wasn't lost. She knew where that cabin was. She had been there before. A week later, after I'd gone back home, I looked up the place online. The cabin wasn't listed anywhere now. The rental page had been taken down. I found an old forum post from years ago about a similar cabin near the same area, where someone mentioned finding old women's clothes and photographs left inside when they rented it. The owner had sold it after trespassing problems. That detail stuck with me, trespassing problems. I thought about those footprints, the scrape on the wall, the way she stood without moving. Whoever she wasn't random. She had probably been living around that forest for years, watching anyone who came too close, waiting until they left. Every now and then, I still dream about that night. The slow scrape under the window, the stillness in the trees, that narrow face barely visible through the fog. It doesn't feel like fear anymore. It feels like memory, like I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and she knew it. I never went back to that part of England again. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone late at night and pass through some empty countryside, I glance at the tree lines without meaning to, half expecting to see that same thin figure standing there again, still watching, still waiting for someone foolish enough to stop. It was early October, the kind of cold that seeps in before winter has even begun. The air in northern Vermont always had that sharp edge to it this time of year, carrying the smell of wet leaves and soil that never quite dried. I had taken a few days off from work to get away from everything. No city noise, no traffic, no people, just silence. I'd rented an old cabin that sat at the edge of a graveyard. I didn't know that part when I booked it. The online listing had called it a historic property surrounded by nature. It didn't mention that the nature included rows of headstones just beyond the backyard fence. When I first pulled up, I remember the crunch of gravel under the tires, how the trees pressed close around the dirt road like they were trying to swallow it. The cabin was smaller than I'd expected. One floor, a slanted roof covered in moss, and shutters that looked like they hadn't been painted in 50 years. There was a smell in the air, not bad but old, like rainwater trapped in wood. I carried my bags inside, setting them down on the wooden floor that creaked under every step. The place had just enough furniture to get by. One couch that sagged in the middle, a small wooden table, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. There were 2 windows facing the back, and through them I could see the graveyard. It started maybe 30 feet from the cabin. Most of the headstones leaned at odd angles. Their engravings faded, some half buried in weeds. That first night I tried to ignore it. I cooked something simple, canned soup on the old stove, and sat by the small fireplace to stay warm. The wind outside kept whistling through cracks in the walls, and I could hear the loose boards on the porch tapping every now and then. It was peaceful in a strange way. I told myself I'd get used to it. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was no reason for it, no sound I could name, just that kind of heavy silence that feels too thick. I lay still, listening. The floorboards creaked again, but slower this time, like someone stepping carefully across them. I turned my head toward the window, and that's when I noticed the faint light outside. Not a flashlight or anything bright, just a dull, flickering glow somewhere in the graveyard. At first I thought it might have been someone visiting a grave late at night, maybe locals, maybe teenagers messing around. But the longer I watched, the stranger it seemed. The light moved slowly between the rows, then disappeared completely. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten, my body stiff from the cold and from staying so still. The next morning, I walked out there. The grass was damp, and my boots sank into the soft soil. I found nothing. No lantern, no footprints that weren't mine, no sign of anyone. The graves were old, the newest from 1923. Most of the names had worn away, but I could still make out a few, carved deep into cracked marble. It was strange standing there. The quiet was so deep that even the sound of my breathing felt out of place. I tried not to think about it for the rest of the day. I took a short hike, came back before sunset, and chopped some firewood behind the cabin. But when night came, that feeling of unease returned stronger than before. Couldn't relax. Every small sound, the wind through the trees, the cabin's old walls groaning, felt too deliberate. I sat by the fire again, watching the shadows move along the walls. It was near midnight again when I heard the sound outside. Not footsteps this time, but something dragging across the ground. Slow, uneven. I froze. It came from the back of the cabin, near where the graveyard began. The dragging sound stopped after a few seconds, replaced by what sounded like a faint scrape, like someone moving a stone. I waited for it to stop completely, then I turned off the fire and walked quietly to the window. The yard was dark except for the dim moonlight. The gravestones stood like crooked teeth in the dirt. For a moment, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed one of the graves, a newer-looking one, had a small pile of fresh soil beside it. It looked like it had been disturbed. I stood there for a long time, staring, not sure what to think. Maybe an animal had dug there. That was the only explanation that made sense. But when I went out the next morning, the soil looked even more displaced, like someone had dug at it during the night. I didn't touch it. I just stared for a while and went back inside. The whole place suddenly felt different. Not quiet anymore, but tense. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Small marks near the back door like something had scraped the wood, the faint smell of earth near the porch, and once, what looked like a muddy handprint near the window frame. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept every light on in the cabin. I sat in the chair by the window with my flashlight ready, staring out into the dark. Hours passed with nothing happening. Around 3 a.m., I heard the dragging again. Closer this time, right outside the wall behind me. I held my breath. The sound paused, then started again, moving toward the window. I aimed the flashlight outside. The beam landed on something pale and dirty near the edge of the graveyard. A man, or what was left of one. He wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. He was just a person. A thin, filthy man crawling slowly through the grass, his clothes torn and covered in mud. His skin looked dry and cracked, his face barely visible under a mess of hair and dirt. He moved like every motion hurt. For a second I thought maybe he needed help, but then I saw his eyes, wide, unfocused, and empty in a way that didn't make sense. I stepped back from the window. He stopped moving like he could sense I was watching. Then he started again, dragging himself toward the cabin. The sound of his weight scraping across the dirt was unbearable. I grabbed my bag and my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't even close the door behind me. I ran to my truck, started it, and reversed so fast the tires spun in the gravel. As the headlights swept across the graveyard, I saw him again, standing now, swaying slightly, staring straight at me. Then the light moved past him, and I was gone down the dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. I found a small gas station that was open all night and sat there in the parking lot until sunrise. I tried to explain to myself what I'd seen. Maybe a vagrant, maybe someone living out there, someone not right in the head. That had to be it. But even then, the image of him stayed with me. The cracked skin, the way he moved, the way he stared. The next afternoon, I called the local sheriff's office. I told them about the cabin, about someone possibly living or hiding near the graveyard. They said they'd send someone out. A week later, I got a short email from the rental company saying the cabin was no longer available for bookings due to maintenance issues. Months have passed since then. I still think about that man sometimes, about how he looked like he'd been buried there and somehow clawed his way back out. Not because of anything supernatural, but because maybe he'd been put there alive. Maybe that fresh dirt wasn't from an animal. I'll never know. But sometimes, when I drive past old cemeteries or see rundown cabins on the edge of the woods, I feel that same tightness in my chest. I think about how close I was to something I can't fully explain, and how that place is probably still out there. The cabin by the graveyard, the half-dug grave, and whatever's left of the man still trying to crawl out of the earth that was meant to keep him buried. It was late autumn of 2013 when I decided to drive up north into the quieter parts of Scotland, near Inverness. I had been working construction for nearly a decade, and at 32, my body was starting to feel the wear of early mornings, cold steel, and cement dust. I wanted a few days alone, far from everything. No noise, no people, no phone signal. I didn't book a hotel or cottage. I just wanted to explore and sleep where I could. I had my old sleeping bag, a camping stove, and enough food to last a few days. The plan was simple: drive through the rural backroads, find somewhere isolated, and just stay there for a while. By the third day, I was somewhere deep in the woods near a place called Strathglass. The air felt heavier there, damp and cold even in daylight. I was driving slowly on a narrow, cracked road when I noticed a dirt path branching off to the right. It wasn't on the map. The path was rough and uneven, but curiosity pushed me to take it. After about a 10-minute drive, I saw something through the trees, a dark structure, half hidden by overgrown bushes. I stopped the car, turned it off, and just listened for a moment. It was silent, completely silent. Even the wind had stopped. When I stepped out, the smell of wet soil and rotting leaves hit me. I walked closer and realized it was an old wooden cabin. The cabin looked abandoned for decades. The roof sagged in the middle, parts of it covered with moss. The windows were dusty, one of them cracked, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The wood had turned almost black from age and rain. There were no tire tracks or footprints, just thick mud and fallen branches around it. Still, I felt drawn to it, maybe because it felt untouched, forgotten by time. I pushed the door open, creaked so loudly it echoed through the trees. Inside, the air was cold and stale, filled with that sharp smell of mold and old timber. The first thing I saw was a table in the middle, covered in a layer of dust thick enough to leave finger trails in. On one side of the room was a small iron stove, rusted and bent. There were two wooden chairs, one lying broken near the wall. The floorboards were warped, some of them soft from rot. I went room by room. There were only two, one main room and a smaller one that might have been used as a bedroom. The smaller room had an old mattress with stuffing spilling out, a wooden dresser, and a single boot in the corner. I could see faint markings on the walls, like scratches or carvings, but they were too faded to make sense of. I didn't feel scared at first, just uneasy. The kind of unease you get when you realize you're in a place where no one has been for a long time. I set up my sleeping bag near the corner of the main room and decided I'd stay there for the night. It was already late afternoon, and I didn't feel like driving back in the dark. As the light faded, I made a small fire in the stove using some dry branches I found outside. It filled the cabin with a faint orange glow, and for a moment, it felt almost peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. After a while, I started hearing sounds outside, faint cracking noises, like someone stepping on dry twigs. I told myself it was just animals, probably deer or foxes. But what unsettled me was that the sounds would stop whenever I paid attention, and start again when I tried to ignore them. It went on like that for hours. Every few minutes, a noise, then silence. I tried to distract myself by writing in a small notebook I carried, but I couldn't focus. The walls seemed to creak on their own, and the fire was dying faster than I expected. I added more wood, but the flames barely grew. The light flickered unevenly, throwing strange shadows across the walls. Sometime around midnight, I heard something heavier outside. It wasn't footsteps now, it was more like dragging. A slow, scraping sound that came from behind the cabin and then stopped near the side window. My chest tightened. I stayed completely still, staring at the window. The glass was dirty, but I could see movement behind it. Just faint, slow movement. My first thought was that someone was there. Maybe a local or a squatter or some drunk who'd wandered too far. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept in my bag and waited. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then the noise stopped. Nothing but wind after that. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing outside, waiting. When morning came, I opened the door slowly and stepped out. The ground was wet from a light drizzle. I walked around to the side where I'd heard the noise. There were marks in the mud, long, uneven ones, like something had been dragged. Not footprints, just long, messy streaks that went toward the trees and disappeared into the woods. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal, something carrying prey. But it didn't look right. It looked too heavy, too wide. I followed the trail for a few meters, but it faded fast. The woods were silent again, like nothing had happened. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something new. The door to the smaller room, the one that was open when I arrived, was now closed. I was sure I hadn't touched it. My stomach turned cold. I went closer and pushed it open. The room was the same as before, except for one thing. The boot that was lying in the corner was now near the doorway, standing upright, as if someone had just placed it there. That was enough for me. I packed my things fast. My hands were shaking. I didn't bother to clean up or check the stove. I just wanted to leave. When I got outside, I looked back once. The cabin looked the same as it did when I first saw it, silent and still, but something about it felt wrong now, like it was watching me leave. The drive back felt longer. I kept checking my mirrors even though there was nothing behind me. By the time I reached the main road, it was raining hard. I didn't stop until I found a small petrol station miles away. When I went inside to buy coffee, the old man at the counter noticed how muddy and shaken I looked. He asked if I'd been off the main roads. I told him I had, somewhere near Strathglass. He just stared at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. I didn't stay to talk. I drove straight back home that evening. For a long time after, I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. I tried looking it up online later, but I couldn't find anything about it. No mention, no records, nothing. I even went through old maps and satellite images. It wasn't there. 2 months later, I saw something that made me freeze. I was scrolling through a local Facebook group about hiking and abandoned places in the Highlands. Someone had posted photos from a recent trip. One of the pictures showed the same area where I'd been. In the background, half covered by trees, was that same cabin. But the caption said the photo was taken years ago, in 2007. The comments said the cabin had burned down not long after. I stared at that photo for a long time. I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe I was in the wrong place, maybe it wasn't the same cabin. But every time I think back to that night, the dragging sound, the boot moved near the door, the marks in the mud, I know exactly what I saw and exactly where I was. I never went back to the Highlands after that. I still take road trips sometimes, but I don't go off the main paths anymore. When I see old dirt roads disappearing into the woods, I keep driving. Some places aren't meant to be found again. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a short trip to northern Arizona, away from the crowded city. I was 32 at the time, working remotely as a freelance photographer, and I had this habit of going on short solo trips whenever I felt overwhelmed. I found an old cabin listed on a small local website, deep in the forest near the Mogollon Rim. The pictures looked decent, wooden walls darkened by age, a rusty metal roof, and a small porch that faced the thick pine trees. The owner said it hadn't been used much since his grandfather passed away, but it had working power and water. That was enough for me. I packed my gear, camera, some food, and my dog, Max, and drove up early on a Friday morning. The drive was long and quiet. Once I got past the small town of Payson, the road narrowed and turned into a dirt track. The forest seemed endless. Tall trees on both sides, the smell of pine, and the constant sound of crickets mixed with the hum of the truck engine. I didn't see another car the entire hour after leaving the main road. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected but looked solid. The windows were old but unbroken, and there was an old shed standing a few yards behind it, partly hidden by overgrown weeds. I unloaded everything, checked inside, and found it exactly how I imagined an old forest cabin would be. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a single bed, and a small kitchen. There was dust on everything, but I didn't mind. Max ran around sniffing every corner, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. After cleaning up a bit, I made some coffee and sat outside on the porch. The air was cold even in summer, and there was this deep stillness in the forest, the kind that almost made your ears ring. Later that evening, I took Max for a short walk along a narrow trail behind the cabin. The light was dim, that time right before dusk when everything looks washed in gray. About 20 minutes down the trail, I noticed something strange: footprints. They were long, too long to be normal human prints. The toes were wide apart and pressed deeper into the dirt, almost like someone barefoot had walked there, but heavier. I knelt down and ran my fingers over them. They weren't old, maybe a day or two at most. I assumed it might have been a hunter or a hiker, but I didn't see any boot marks, just those barefoot impressions. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The forest was louder than usual, constant rustling, an occasional crack of a branch, and Max kept shifting beside the bed. Around midnight, I heard something move near the porch. It wasn't an animal scurrying sound. It was slow, heavy steps. Max stood up, ears raised, growling low. I froze. I listened, every muscle tense. The steps moved toward the window, and then I saw a shadow slide across the thin curtain. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped. I could see the outline of its shoulders, but they looked uneven, like something wasn't right about how it stood. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, waiting for it to move away. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, and the forest went quiet again. The next morning, I found faint smudges on the porch railing, like dirt-covered hands had gripped it. I tried to brush it off as an animal, maybe a bear, though deep down I knew it wasn't. The shape of those marks was too human. I decided to stay another night, mostly because I didn't want to drive that long stretch of dirt road after dark. I kept my camera nearby and checked my truck twice before the sun went down. The second night felt heavier. The air was colder, the wind stronger. I locked every door and window. Around 1 a.m., Max started barking fiercely, facing the back wall. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it out the window. The beam caught something moving between the trees. A pale figure, tall and thin, standing too still. Its limbs seemed off, slightly bent the wrong way, as if it wasn't built right. I turned off the light instantly, my heart hammering. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, half hidden behind the trees. After several minutes, it slowly crouched, almost like it was studying the cabin. Max wouldn't stop growling. I sat against the wall, clutching a small camping knife, waiting for the noise to stop. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I went outside, shaking. The ground was covered in prints, not like the ones I saw before. These were deeper, erratic, like someone had been pacing or crawling near the cabin all night. The area near the shed had them the most. I opened the shed door cautiously, and the smell hit me first, something foul, like decaying meat. Inside, it was dark and cold. Old tools hung on the wall, and piles of wood were stacked in one corner. Then I saw something in the dirt. A torn piece of clothing, stained brown and stiff. It looked like part of a shirt, but the fabric was thick and old, maybe decades old. There was also a large dark patch on the floor, almost black. I didn't want to know what it was. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I packed everything into the truck as fast as I could, Max whining the whole time. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed movement on the tree-line again. This time it was clearer. The same pale figure, now closer. It was walking slowly, like it didn't care that I was watching. Its face, or what I could see of it, looked wrong. The eyes were set too wide apart, the mouth too low. Its skin looked stretched, dry, and tight, almost like it didn't belong on that frame. It stopped about 20 yards away and tilted its head slightly, like it was trying to understand what I was. I didn't wait. I slammed the truck door shut, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could down that dirt road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror the whole way, expecting to see it following, but there was nothing, just trees and dust. When I got back to town, I stopped at a gas station. The attendant saw how pale I looked and asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and bought a bottle of water. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. It sounded insane even to me. A few weeks later, I looked up that area again out of curiosity. I found a few old forum posts about strange disappearances near the same stretch of forest. Hikers who went missing, hunters who never came back. Some people mentioned something they called a skinwalker, an old legend from native folklore. I never believed in that kind of thing, but the way they described it, the way it moved, the way it mimicked, it fit exactly what I saw. I never went back to that cabin. I deleted the photos I took there, sold my camping gear, and avoided any place that remote again. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about that face. The way it stood there like it knew me. The sound of those slow steps outside my window. And every once in a while, when I take Max out for a walk at night, he still stops, ears raised, staring into the darkness like he hears something I don't. I tell myself it's nothing, just an animal, the wind, or my imagination. But deep down, I know exactly what that sound reminds me of. That thing in the forest hadn't just been wandering. It had been watching, and I had been lucky to leave before it decided to come closer. It was late October, the year 2014, when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a few days at a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had rented the place online, a weathered old cabin tucked between thick pines and an overgrown trail that led down to a lake. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden structure with a tin roof, a stone fireplace, a single bedroom, and a porch that looked out toward the trees. I wanted peace, a place to disconnect from everything, and for the first day or two, I got exactly that. The air was cold and crisp, the kind that stings your face but feels clean when you breathe it in. By the third night, the isolation started to sink in. The silence was heavy. No distant cars, no voices, just the faint rustling of wind moving through the branches and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. I had brought a small generator for power, but I kept it off most of the time because the sound ruined the stillness. I used a lantern at night, an old kerosene one that gave the cabin a soft amber glow. Everything about the place felt detached from time, like it hadn't been touched for decades. That night, I had gone to bed around 10. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and the cold crept in through the cracks in the wooden walls. I had a small wood stove that I kept burning to stay warm. The flicker of the fire was the only light inside. I remember lying on the bed, listening to the soft crackle of the wood, watching shadows shift on the ceiling. I wasn't quite asleep yet, just resting in that quiet state where your mind drifts but you're still aware of the room around you. At some point, I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual rustle of wind or the creak of branches. It sounded heavier, a distinct crunch of footsteps moving through the dried leaves. Slow, careful. I froze for a moment, just listening. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk wandering near the cabin. But the sound didn't fit. The steps weren't random. They were steady, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat up quietly, the wooden floor cold under my feet. The lantern had gone out a while ago, and the room was dim except for the fading glow from the stove. I stood still, trying to listen again, but for a few seconds, there was nothing. Just that heavy, empty quiet. Then it came again, this time closer, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I could tell by the way the sound echoed faintly between the trees. I moved toward the small window beside the door, barely breathing. The night outside was pitch black, but with the faint reflection of the firelight behind me, I could make out vague outlines, the dark shape of the woods, the faint glimmer of frost on the ground. I didn't see anything. I waited there for a good minute, eyes straining. The air felt thick, and every second stretched out longer than it should have. Then the crunching stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like whoever or whatever it was had realized I was listening. I stood there motionless for what felt like forever, until finally, I decided it was nothing to worry about. Probably an animal. I tried to go back to bed, but the sound wouldn't leave my mind. I kept picturing someone standing just out of view, behind a tree, watching the cabin. I stayed awake for another hour, staring at the ceiling, before I drifted off again. When I woke up, it was around 6 a.m., the dim blue light of dawn seeping through the curtains. The first thing I did was step outside. The ground was cold and covered with a thin layer of frost. I walked around the side of the cabin, my breath fogging in the air, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They started near the edge of the trees and came right up to the porch. They weren't boot prints like mine, but flat, worn shoe marks, maybe from sneakers. They led to the side window, the one beside my bed, then turned back toward the woods. The tracks looked fresh, pressed deep into the frozen ground. Whoever it was must have been there last night while I was awake, just standing there, watching. The realization made my stomach twist. I followed the prints for a bit, but they disappeared once they reached the thicker woods. The trees were dense, the ground covered with dry needles and leaves. It was useless to try and track further. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I knew a simple lock wouldn't stop anyone determined enough. I kept telling myself it was probably some hiker, maybe a hunter who got lost, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Nobody would be wandering that deep in the woods at night, especially in that cold. The day passed slow. I tried to distract myself by chopping some firewood, fixing a loose hinge on the door, anything to keep my mind off what I saw. By late afternoon, I had almost convinced myself it didn't matter. Maybe someone passed through and left. But when night came again, that uneasy feeling returned stronger than before. The fire was burning low when I heard it again. The same slow, careful crunch of footsteps in the dark. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned off the lantern completely and stood near the stove, staring at the window. The sound was closer this time. It circled the cabin. I could hear twigs snapping and faint breathing. Not animal breathing, human. I stayed still, every muscle tight, listening. The steps stopped near the back wall. Then something brushed against the wood. A light scraping like a hand sliding across the siding. I felt every hair on my neck stand up. I thought about shouting, but I knew there was no one for miles. No help. I grabbed the old hunting rifle that hung by the door. It wasn't loaded. I hadn't planned on using it, but just holding it made me feel less helpless. I stood there, waiting, not daring to move. The scraping stopped. Silence again. I waited for what must have been 15 minutes before I heard the sound fade away into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the stove until morning light came through the window. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was another set of footprints. This time, they were all around the cabin, circling it. Again, the same flat shoes, same deep impressions. I followed them a few feet into the woods before I stopped. On one of the trees, about chest height, was a mark. A small knife cut in the bark, fresh and clean. I looked around and saw another and another spaced every few feet, like someone had marked a path around the place. That was it for me. I packed my things fast, just threw everything into the truck and didn't even bother cleaning up. The air was cold, and I could feel eyes on me the whole time I loaded the bags. I didn't look back at the trees. I just got in, started the engine, and drove. The dirt road out was narrow and rough, with branches scraping the sides of the truck. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. It took almost an hour before I hit the paved road that led back toward town. I stopped at a gas station there to fill up and try to calm down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pump. I told the owner of the gas station about the footprints, asked if anyone lived near that area. He said no, just empty forest for miles. He said people sometimes go missing out there during hunting season, and that a few cabins had been broken into in the past, though no one ever found who did it. He told me I was lucky to get out without anything worse happening. I never went back to that cabin. I got an email from the rental site a few months later asking for a review, but I deleted it. Even now, I still remember those footprints, how they came right up to the window, how the marks on the trees surrounded the place like someone had been planning something. I think about how quiet it was that night. No voices, no words, just the sound of someone slowly circling me in the dark, knowing I was inside and too afraid to come out. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about those cuts in the trees. They weren't random. They were too evenly spaced, too deliberate. I think whoever made them wasn't just passing through. They were marking something, maybe counting nights, maybe just letting me know they'd been there. And the worst part is, I never saw a face, never heard a word, just those careful, patient steps and the silence that followed. It was late October of 1998, and the rain hadn't stopped for 2 straight days. The kind of rain that didn't just fall, but poured with weight, steady, cold, and relentless. I was 31 then, living alone after a long breakup that had emptied my small apartment and left me wanting distance from everything familiar. I decided to take a week off work and drive out into the woods near the Welsh border, where I had always wanted to build a small cabin of my own, a place quiet enough that I could hear myself think. I had borrowed an old pickup truck from a friend, packed a chainsaw, some tools, a roll of tarp, food, and a single sleeping bag. I told myself I'd just spend a few nights out there, cut some timber, and get the base of the cabin started before winter really set in. When I arrived, the rain had already turned the dirt road into thick mud. The forest was darker than I remembered. Tall pine and oak trees crowding close together, the ground littered with wet leaves that gave off a heavy, earthy smell. There was no one around for miles. The nearest farmhouse was about 10 kilometers away. I parked beside a clearing I had chosen earlier in the summer. The rain was coming down so hard that I had to shout just to hear myself think, though there was no one to hear me anyway. The first day, I barely got anything done. I tried to mark out the area for the cabin using small stakes, but the ground was soft and my hands were already numb from the cold. My jacket was soaked through in an hour. By late afternoon, I managed to drag a few fallen logs near the clearing to start shaping the base of the cabin. I set up a tarp between 2 trees to make a rough shelter for the night. The rain never let up. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the rain drum against the tarp and the truck. I could hear the forest shifting, branches cracking, the occasional rustle of something moving in the dark. I wasn't scared, not at first. I had been camping before, but there was something about that kind of isolation, that deep silence between the sound of rain, that made me feel uneasy. The air smelled of wet bark and soil, thick enough to taste. Every so often I'd hear the wind push through the trees, a long, low moan that seemed to travel across the forest like a voice too far away to understand. I tried to sleep, but the ground was uneven, and the cold crept into my clothes. The second day, I woke to a fog that made the woods look endless. The rain was still falling, but slower now, more like a steady drizzle. I ate a piece of bread and canned beans straight from the tin, then started working again. I sawed and lifted until my back ached. My hands were raw from gripping wet wood. By evening, I had managed to raise a simple frame. For rough walls made from uneven logs, no roof yet, no door. It was small, barely enough space for one person, but I was proud of it. I thought maybe one more day and I could get the roof beams in place. That night, the rain came back stronger than before. I had no choice but to move my sleeping bag inside the half-finished cabin, hoping the walls would block the wind. I covered the open top with the tarp, weighed it down with stones, and lay down in the corner. The sound of rain hitting the tarp was deafening. The smell of damp wood and mud filled the small space. I could feel the vibration of thunder rolling somewhere far away. It must have been around midnight when I first heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the rain or the forest. It was faint at first, a dull thud, like something heavy hitting wood. I thought maybe one of the logs had slipped in the wind. I ignored it, but then it came again, louder this time, closer. I sat up, my heart starting to pound. The sound stopped. The only thing left was rain hammering on the tarp. I tried to tell myself it was just the weather, maybe a branch falling nearby. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Slow, heavy steps outside, sinking into the wet ground. I froze. I could hear water splashing under the weight of each step. Then it stopped right outside the wall of the cabin. I didn't breathe. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard a sharp creak, wood bending slightly, as if someone was leaning on it. The sound of breathing followed. Slow, uneven breathing. My stomach turned cold. I didn't move. I stared at the small gap under the tarp where rainwater dripped through, waiting for the next sound. After a while, the breathing stopped, and all I could hear again was the rain. I stayed awake the rest of that night, clutching my pocket knife even though I knew it wouldn't do much. Every time the rain shifted or a branch fell, I jumped. When dawn finally came, I crawled out into the wet clearing, my boots sinking in the mud. There were footprints around the cabin, large, deep ones. Too big to be mine, too wide to belong to a deer or animal. They went from the tree lean to the wall and back again, vanishing into the fog. I told myself someone must have wandered through the woods. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost, but it didn't feel like that. The tracks stopped too close, too deliberate. I decided to work faster that day. I wanted to finish the roof to make the place feel secure, even if just in my mind. I worked non-stop, cutting and lifting until my muscles burned. The rain never stopped, but I barely noticed. I just wanted to be done. By late afternoon, the cabin finally had a roof. It wasn't perfect. Gaps between the beams still let water drip through, but it was enough to keep most of the rain out. I made a small fire inside using dry bark I had kept under the truck bed. The warmth felt like life itself. I sat beside it, shaking from exhaustion, staring at the small flame flickering against the wet walls. Night came again, darker and colder than before. The rain had turned heavier. Wind pushed against the walls, making them groan slightly. I could feel the structure move with each gust. I sat awake for hours, watching the shadows move as the fire dimmed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same sound, slow, dragging footsteps outside. They circled the cabin once, steady and patient. Then I heard the crunch of something being dragged through the mud. I could hear breathing again, heavier this time, mixed with the sound of rain. My body was shaking, but not from cold. I reached for the small axe beside me, holding it tight. The footsteps stopped. Then something hit the wall. Not a knock. A heavy blow, hard enough to make the wood vibrate. Another hit followed, then another. I stood up, pressing my back against the opposite wall, holding the axe ready. I thought it was someone trying to break in. I waited for the sound to come again, but it didn't. Just the wind and rain. After maybe half an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, pushed the door open, and stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the rain, catching the mist and making everything glow white. The clearing was empty. I turned the light toward the trees. Nothing moved, but then I saw it. A pile of wood stacked neatly near the cabin wall. Fresh-cut logs, still wet and clean. Someone had been working outside while I was inside. That's when I realized the truth. Whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't trying to harm me. They were helping me build. The next morning, I packed up everything and left. I didn't even look back at the cabin. The rain followed me all the way back down the muddy road. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't even try to explain it to myself. But a week later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back there. The cabin was finished. Roof sealed, door fitted, even the floor leveled with packed dirt. It looked complete, like someone had been living there. But there were no signs of life, no footprints, no tools, nothing. Just the quiet hum of the forest after the rain. I never went back after that. I don't know who built the rest of it, and I never tried to find out. But sometimes, when it rains late at night, and I hear the slow, steady rhythm of drops on the roof, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin. And I wonder if somewhere deep in those woods, the rain is still falling on that small cabin. Standing there alone, waiting for someone else to finish what I started. It was late September of 2018 when I decided to take a long drive through the northern woods of Maine. I hadn't been up that way in almost a decade, not since my ex-wife, Marlene, and I had split up. We used to spend summers out there, in a small wooden cabin her father had built years before we met. After the divorce, I stayed far away from anything that reminded me of that place. But that day, with the air crisp and the leaves turning deep orange, something made me take the longer route home, the one that wound through the back roads near the lake where her family's cabin sat. I told myself I just wanted to see if the place was still standing. I didn't have any real reason to go that way, but once the thought was in my head, it stuck there like a splinter. It had been 10 years, and I figured the cabin was probably abandoned or sold off by now. The road leading to it hadn't changed much. It was still narrow and uneven, with roots breaking through the asphalt and patches of gravel that made the tires hum. The forest on both sides was thick and quiet. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of the lake through the trees, gray, still, reflecting the dull sky. I didn't see any other cars. The further I went, the more the feeling crept in that I shouldn't be there. It wasn't fear exactly, just a kind of heaviness that made my chest feel tight. When I reached the old turnoff, I almost missed it. The dirt path was half hidden by overgrown weeds and branches. I slowed the car and stared at it for a while. I remembered how Marlene used to make me stop right there so she could jump out and open the gate. There was no gate anymore, just a rusted metal hinge hanging from one post. I pulled in slowly, my tires crunching over the gravel and wet leaves. The cabin came into view after a few minutes, sitting just beyond a line of birch trees. It looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was darker, the roof sagging a little, and part of the porch railing was missing. I parked a few yards away and got out, feeling the cold air slide into my jacket. The smell hit me first, that mix of wet earth, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic, like rust or old nails. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it in. Memories came in flashes. Mornings drinking coffee on that porch, evenings chopping wood while she cooked inside. The two of us lying awake listening to rain hit the tin roof. It was strange how quiet everything was now. No birds, no wind through the trees, just the faint ticking sound of the cooling engine behind me. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the damp ground. The front steps creaked under my weight. The door was shut but not locked. The handle turned easily. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and mold. The floorboards were warped, the wallpaper peeling in long curls. There were still bits of furniture, the old couch we'd found at a flea market, the little table by the window, even one of her chairs with the woven seat coming apart. It looked like no one had been there in years, but nothing had been stolen or thrown around. It was like the place had been left to rot slowly, untouched. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the rough wood beneath the faded paint. It was colder inside than outside, though the windows were shut tight. I went into the small kitchen. The sink was stained, and a pile of old dishes sat in it, caked with dust. The calendar on the wall still showed 2008. A faded note was pinned beside it, written in her handwriting, though I didn't bother to read what it said. I didn't want to open that door in my head. The bedroom was at the back, down a short hallway that smelled of damp and mildew. The bed frame was still there, stripped bare, one leg leaning slightly inward. A broken lamp lay on the floor, its cord tangled like a dead snake. I felt that same tightness in my chest again. Not fear, exactly, but something close. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint scraping sound from the far corner of the room. I froze. It wasn't loud, just soft and slow, like something dragging across the floor. I waited, listening. Came again, a little sharper this time. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten trapped inside. I took a step closer, and the floor groaned under my boot. The sound stopped. I waited another moment, then crouched down to look under the bed frame. There was nothing but a dark space and a pile of old dust. I stood up again, heart beating a little too fast for comfort. I told myself I was being stupid. It was an old cabin, full of noises, the wind, the wood settling, maybe a mouse or two. I turned back toward the living room, but as I stepped into the hallway, I caught sight of something on the floor just near the door. A shoe print. It wasn't mine. The sole pattern was different, wider, with a thicker tread. The dirt around it was damp, not dry. That meant it was recent. I stopped moving. My first instinct was to call out, but then I remembered how quiet the woods were outside. I didn't want to hear anything answer me. My throat felt dry. I scanned the room again, looking for any other sign. Another footprint, a jacket, something. But there was only that single print, leading from the door toward the bedroom. I moved slowly toward the front of the cabin, listening for any sound. The air felt heavier now, like the whole place was holding its breath. My eyes kept darting to the corners, to the shadows near the window. I reached the door and looked outside. Everything was still. The car sat where I'd left it. The trees barely moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I backed out of the cabin and stepped down from the porch. The ground squelched softly under my boots. I glanced around again, scanning the edge of the woods. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, just a slight shift, maybe 30 yards off near the birch trees. It was quick, almost like someone stepping behind a trunk. I stood still for a long moment, staring at that spot. I couldn't tell if it had really been a person or if I'd imagined it. The light was dim, and the mist had started to rise off the lake, curling low between the trees. I didn't want to find out which it was. I got back into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a while with my hands on the wheel. The cabin looked smaller through the windshield, like it was sinking into the earth. I kept watching the tree lean, half expecting to see someone step out, but no one did. Finally, I started the engine. The sound broke the silence, sharp and strange. I reversed down the narrow drive, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, and I didn't look back again until I hit the main road. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something or someone there. Maybe it was a hunter or a drifter using the place for shelter. Maybe it was nothing at all. But when I stopped at a gas station an hour later and looked down, I noticed something stuck to the bottom of my boot. A thin smear of mud mixed with what looked like ash, the same kind that had covered the floor inside. That night, back in my apartment, I sat staring at the dirt still clinging to the tread of my boots. I thought about that shoe print on the floor and the way the trees had shifted just before I left. I couldn't explain any of it, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't be going back there again. Whatever or whoever was using that cabin now, it wasn't my business anymore. I went to the sink, rinsed the mud off my boots, and threw them in the trash. Then I shut the window, locked it, and left the lights on that night, even though I told myself I didn't believe in anything to be afraid of. It wasn't about belief, it was about knowing when to stay away. The next morning, I looked up the property records out of curiosity. The lot was still registered under Marlene's family name. There hadn't been any sale or transfer since 2008. I stared at that date for a long while before closing the browser. It didn't matter who or what was there now. That chapter of my life had ended long ago. But somewhere deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, after all those years, the cabin had decided it didn't want to be left alone anymore. It was late September of 1998 when I drove up into the northern woods of Montana, just outside a small forgotten town called Elkhorn Bend. I was 36 at the time, and I had taken a few weeks off from work to get away from people, noise, and everything else that came with city life. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and he'd left behind an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a tin roof, wood stove, and a front porch that sagged in the middle, but I figured it would do just fine for a few quiet days. I wanted to fix it up a bit, maybe even make it a place to come back to when life started getting too heavy. The road that led there was barely a road anymore, more like a dirt trail that had been swallowed by mud and weeds. I had to park my truck about half a mile down and carry my supplies the rest of the way. The air was damp and cold, smelling of pine and old rain. The forest around me was silent, except for the slow dripping of water from the branches and the crunch of my boots on wet soil. When I first saw the cabin, I could tell it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were clouded with dust, and the wood siding had turned gray. Moss had crept up the north wall like a thick blanket. Inside, it smelled like dry rot and old paper. The place was small, one bed frame against the wall, a small iron stove, a table with a rusted lantern, and a few broken chairs. There were old cans stacked in one corner, some still sealed, others rusted through. I swept the floor, cleared cobwebs from the corners, and got the stove going. The warmth felt good after a long day, and for a while, everything seemed fine. By the second night, the quiet started to feel strange. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too quiet. I realized I hadn't heard any animals since I got there. No birds, no crickets, nothing. Even the wind seemed to stay still between the trees. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just my city nerves making me uneasy. Still, something about the air around that cabin felt wrong. Heavy somehow, like it didn't want me there. On the third day, I started cleaning the back shed that sat a few yards from the cabin. It was smaller, made from darker wood, and had a padlock hanging from the latch that had long since rusted through. When I pushed the door open, a strong smell of decay hit me. The inside was dark, colder than outside, and lined with shelves that were mostly empty except for a few old tools. The dirt floor had strange dark stains on it, round and uneven. At first, I thought it was oil, but the smell said otherwise. I opened the small window to let air in and noticed the ground outside behind the shed was uneven, like someone had dug there years ago and the earth had sunk a little since. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up around midnight, rattling the loose boards on the roof. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows move with the flickering light from the lantern. My mind kept going back to that uneven patch of dirt behind the shed. It didn't look natural. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me hard, and the forest seemed even darker than before. My boots sank into the wet ground as I walked around to the back of the shed. The beam from my flashlight shook a little as I knelt down over the soft patch of earth. The soil looked disturbed, like it had been turned over recently even though no one had been here for years. I started digging with the small hand shovel I'd brought for clearing brush. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell got. I told myself it was probably a dead animal, but when the shovel hit something solid, my stomach tightened. It was a piece of wood, an old box maybe 2 feet wide. I brushed the dirt off and pried it open with the edge of the shovel. Inside were bones, human bones. They weren't complete, but the shape of the skull left no doubt. The eye sockets stared up at me from the shallow pit, the jaw slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. I froze. For a long minute, I just knelt there, staring. My brain refused to process it. When it finally did, I stood up too fast and nearly fell backward. I covered the box again, my hands shaking, and stumbled back to the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the stove, staring at the flames, trying to make sense of what I'd found. My uncle had owned this place for over 40 years. He was quiet, a bit odd maybe, but I never thought he was capable of anything terrible. The more I thought about it, the more I remembered little things from when I was younger. How he never let anyone near that shed. How he'd disappear for days on his hunting trips and come back with no meat, just silence. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed my bags, doused the fire, and locked up the cabin. But something made me go back to the shed one last time. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just needed to be sure of what I saw. I went back to the pit and brushed away a bit of dirt from the edge of the box. There was something else inside that I hadn't noticed before. A small metal chain tangled between the bones. I pulled it out, and attached to it was a small, rusted pendant shaped like a heart. It looked old, but it wasn't something a man like my uncle would wear. When I drove back into town later that day, I stopped at the small sheriff's office near the main road. I didn't know what else to do. I told the deputy that I'd found something near the old Jensen cabin. That's what they called it locally, and that someone should check it out. I didn't give them my name. I just left the location written on a piece of paper. I didn't want to get dragged into whatever that was. A few days later, after I'd returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up old records from Elkhorn Bend online. There wasn't much, but buried in a small-town newspaper archive was a short article from 1979. A young woman named Clara Whitley had gone missing near that area. Last seen heading out for a hike near the forest road that led to my uncle's property. They never found her. I stared at the photo in the article, grainy and faded, but she was wearing the same kind of pendant I'd pulled from the box. That's when everything clicked, and a cold, hollow feeling settled in my stomach. My uncle had died quietly, peacefully, leaving me that cabin as if it were a gift. But what he'd really left behind was a piece of something dark, something he'd buried years ago, thinking no one would ever find it. I didn't go back to Elkhorn Bend after that. The sheriff's office never called me, and I never read another word about it in the papers. Maybe they found her remains and kept it quiet. Maybe they didn't bother digging deep enough. Either way, I knew what I saw and I knew what it meant. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and I can't sleep, I think about that place. The smell of the dirt, the silence of the woods, the way the skull looked under my flashlight. I imagine the cabin still standing there, half rotted, the tin roof clattering in the wind. I imagine someone else finding it someday, maybe walking into that shed the way I did, maybe digging up what I left behind. And every time I think of that heart-shaped pendant, I remember my uncle's calm, distant face and the way he used to sit on the porch when I was a kid, staring off into the trees. I used to think he was watching for deer. Now I wonder if he was watching something else, making sure no one ever looked too close at the ground behind that shed. That cabin isn't just wood and nails anymore. It's a grave, and I left it that way because some things are better left buried, even when you already know the truth. It was early autumn of 2014 when I started working as a park ranger in a quiet part of northern Montana, near the Canadian border. Most of the land there was dense forest, stretching for miles with barely any sign of civilization. The ranger station I was assigned to was a small wooden cabin about 10 miles away from the main visitor center. It sat at the edge of the tree line, facing a long dirt road that cut through the forest like a scar. I was 28 at the time, and I took the job mostly for solitude. I'd been working construction before that, and after an accident on site left me with a bad knee, I wanted something quieter, slower. The cabin seemed perfect for that. Isolated, peaceful, simple. It was an old building, probably built in the early 70s, with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. There was no phone signal, just a two-way radio that connected me to the main station and other rangers. Power came from a small generator behind the cabin and water from a hand pump near the back. The first few weeks were calm. My job was basic. Keep track of wildlife, patrol the trails, log any visitor activity, and make sure hunters weren't sneaking in after hours. Days were long but peaceful, mostly walking through pine trees, listening to wind and birds, and watching the weather change across the valley. Nights, however, were different. The silence there wasn't really silence. The forest had its own voice. Crickets, branches shifting, the occasional distant call of an animal. It could get under your skin if you paid too much attention. I remember the first time I felt uneasy there. It was late one evening in October, maybe around 10 p.m. I was inside the cabin, writing a report about trail maintenance, when I noticed the generator sputter and go quiet. The light flickered and went out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to check on it. The air was cold, and a thin layer of fog had rolled down from the hills, making everything feel smaller, closer. The trees looked darker than usual, and even though I'd walked that area hundreds of times during the day, something about it in that fog made me feel like I was standing somewhere unfamiliar. When I reached the generator, I realized the fuel line had come loose. It wasn't broken, it looked like it had been pulled. There were scratch marks on the side panel, deep enough to scrape off the paint. I remember staring at them for a while, trying to figure out what animal could have done that. Maybe a bear, I thought, though I hadn't seen any signs of one in weeks. I reconnected the line, restarted the generator, and went back inside. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder than usual. Over the next week, I started finding small things out of place. My boots, which I always left beside the door, once ended up near the back window. A map I'd left on the table was folded neatly when I woke up. A metal cup went missing for 2 days and then reappeared on the porch. At first, I blamed my own forgetfulness. Living alone in isolation can mess with your mind a bit. I told myself I was tired, distracted, maybe losing track of my own routine. But then I started finding footprints. They weren't clear at first, just faint impressions in the dirt, a little too big to be mine, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. I noticed them after a rainy night when the ground was soft. They stopped about 20 feet from my porch, then turned back toward the trees. No sign of an animal, no tire tracks, just those prints. A few nights later, around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a slow, steady scraping, like something being dragged across wood. My heart was pounding as I reached for my flashlight and looked through the small window by my bed. The fog was thick again, almost like smoke, and the beam of light barely reached the edge of the porch. The noise stopped. I waited there, holding my breath, trying to listen. After a few seconds, something brushed against the side of the cabin. A dull, slow movement, followed by what sounded like a soft thump near the back wall. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, until I finally heard the distant hum of the generator sputter again. When morning came, I walked around the cabin. On the back wall, just below the window, there were 2 muddy handprints. They weren't smeared, not like an animal mark. They were clean, human handprints. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. Maybe a poacher or a local kid trying to scare the new ranger. But the nearest town was over 30 miles away, and I hadn't seen a single visitor in nearly a week. I called the main station on the radio, but the reception kept cutting out. The only thing I got through was that I thought someone had been near the cabin during the night. They said they'd send someone to check in a few days. Those few days felt like weeks. I barely slept. I kept the flashlight on all night, and every time the generator flickered, my stomach would twist. I started locking everything, the doors, the windows, even the cabinets. During the day, I walked the perimeter, looking for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything. I found more prints, some overlapping mine from before, and one deep set near the pump at the back, like someone had been standing there for a long time. On the 4th night, the power went out again. It was around 2 a.m., and the forest was dead quiet. Not even insects. I sat up in bed, listening, and then I heard it again, the dragging sound. Slow, deliberate, right outside. This time, it circled the cabin. My pulse was racing so fast I could barely breathe. The sound stopped, and then there was a single, heavy knock on the front door. Not loud, but solid. Just once. Then silence. I stayed still for what felt like an hour before I finally forced myself to move. I picked up my rifle, standard issue, kept unloaded by rule, but I didn't care. I loaded it and waited until dawn, sitting in a chair facing the door. The sun came up slow, spreading a dull orange light through the fog. When I finally stepped outside, I saw something lying near the porch steps. A torn piece of fabric. It looked like part of a jacket, dark green, with a patch on it that said Parks Division. Later that morning, another ranger finally arrived. A guy named Harris who'd worked there for years. I didn't say much at first, just pointed to the handprints, the footprints, the fabric. He looked pale. He told me that 2 years earlier, a ranger named Miller had gone missing while stationed at a post not far from there. They searched for weeks but never found him. That was the last time anyone had used that particular cabin until I was sent there. I asked if maybe it was his jacket piece, but Harris said Miller's uniform was never recovered. The patch design, though, matched the older style they stopped using around that time. We drove back to the main station that day, and I didn't go back to the cabin after that. They shut it down again, officially calling it unsafe due to structural issues. I still think about it sometimes, about those nights in the fog, the dragging sound, the handprints. I try to tell myself there's a logical explanation. Maybe someone really was living out there, surviving off the woods. Maybe it was a drifter or a poacher hiding and watching. But every time I picture those prints on the wall, placed perfectly side by side, I remember how quiet it was that night. So quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat and nothing else moving. Even now, when I drive past those forests, I never look toward the tree line, because somewhere out there, Someone knew how to walk silently enough to stand right beside that cabin without making a sound. Someone who waited night after night for the lights to go out. It was late October, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp in your lungs. I had taken a week off work to clear my head and decided to drive out to an old cabin my uncle used to own years ago. It sat on the edge of a pine forest near the base of a mountain in northern Montana. He sold the property before he passed, but the new owners never did much with it, and from what I knew, it had just been sitting there, empty, forgotten, weathering the seasons. I brought my dog, Ranger, a big German shepherd who never liked being away from me for long. I figured it'd be good for both of us, just quiet, space, and a bit of air away from people. The drive out there took almost 6 hours from the small town I lived in. The road turned to gravel after a while, and then to dirt as the trees thickened and shadows stretched across the path. The last few miles were nothing but ruts, rocks, and roots. I had to crawl the truck through most of it. The cabin appeared just as the sky was fading into a dull orange, its shape small and dark between the trees. The place looked rougher than I remembered. Roof sagging in the middle, windows coated with dust, and weeds climbing up the wooden siding. It wasn't much, but I wasn't there for comfort. I parked a few feet from the porch and got out. The air was colder than I expected, the kind that seeps through your jacket if you stand still too long. Ranger jumped down beside me, tail wagging but his ears up, scanning the tree line. There was a smell in the air, pine, damp soil, and something faintly metallic. Probably just old rust or wet wood, I told myself. The steps creaked under my boots as I walked up to the porch. The door gave a long groan when I pushed it open, like it was complaining about being disturbed. Inside, the cabin smelled of stale air and damp wood. Dust floated in the last bit of evening light coming through the window. The furniture was still there. An old couch, a table, a few chairs, but everything had that faded look of being untouched for years. The wood stove sat cold in the corner, its pipe leading up through the ceiling. I set down my bag, unrolled my sleeping mat, and opened one of the windows just a little to let the air move. Ranger sniffed around the corners, his claws clicking on the floorboards, nose twitching. He was calmer once he'd made a full circle around the cabin. I built a small fire in the stove, cooked a can of beans, and sat there listening to the quiet. The wind pushed against the walls every so often, making the roof creak. Ranger lay near the fire, half asleep but with one ear turned toward the door. I watched the flames and tried not to think too much. Being alone in a place like that made you notice every sound, every snap from the wood, every shuffle of branches outside. When I finally turned in for the night, I kept the fire low and pulled my jacket over my face to block the draft that slipped through the cracks in the wall. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then I realized it wasn't. Ranger was standing near the door, staring at it. His fur was slightly raised along his back, his head low but tense. The sound came again, a soft scrape on the porch, then silence. I didn't move for a few seconds. My first thought was maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the scrape was slow, like something being dragged. I quietly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it toward the window. Nothing, just darkness and the outline of trees. I got up, my heartbeat loud in my ears, and slowly opened the door. The porch light I'd rigged with a small battery lantern was still on, but the beam didn't reach far. The ground was wet from dew, and I noticed faint marks in the dirt just beyond the steps, like someone had pulled something heavy. It led toward the tree line and disappeared. Ranger didn't bark, but he stayed close to my leg, his breathing heavy. I stood there for a moment, feeling that uneasy stillness that happens when the woods go completely silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the faint sound of water dripping from the roof. I closed the door and locked it. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every small sound kept my eyes open. Sometime near dawn, I finally drifted off. When I woke again, it was bright outside, sunlight slipping through the cracks in the wood. Ranger was asleep near the door, but I could tell he hadn't relaxed much. His paws twitched, and his ears flicked at every sound. I stepped outside to look around. The marks were still there, clearer now in the daylight. They went around the side of the cabin and stopped near a fallen log. I followed them slowly, crunching leaves under my boots. Behind the log, there was a torn piece of canvas, half buried in dirt. It looked like an old tent cover. Nothing else. Maybe some hunter left it behind. I tried to shake off the unease and went about my day. Collected some firewood, fixed one of the shutters, and boiled water on the stove for coffee. But the whole time, I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line. Ranger stuck close to me, rarely wandering off like he usually did. Around noon, I walked down the path behind the cabin that led to a small stream. The ground was soft from the rain the day before, and I noticed boot prints along the path. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. The tread was different, heavier and deeper, like someone had been carrying weight. They led both ways, toward the cabin and back toward the woods. I didn't like that. The place was supposed to be empty for miles around. I thought about leaving right then, but it was already afternoon, and driving those roads in the dark wasn't something I wanted to do. I decided to pack up early in the morning and head out first light. That night, I kept the fire low and left the lantern on. Ranger lay right beside my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I heard it again. Soft steps outside. Slow, careful. I could hear them on the porch this time. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. The steps stopped right by the door. Then came a faint rattle of the doorknob. Just once, slow. Ranger's growl was low and quiet, deep in his chest. Then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up against the wall until morning, the shotgun I'd brought resting across my knees. When the first light came through the cracks, I got up, packed fast, and stepped outside. The marks on the porch were clear now. Muddy footprints, size 11 maybe, heading away from the cabin toward the trees. I followed them only a few feet before stopping. The prints led to the same path that went down toward the stream. I turned back. No point in finding out more. The drive back was quiet. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, eyes fixed out the window the whole way. I didn't see anyone on the way out, no other vehicles, no movement in the trees, just silence. When I reached the main road, the tension in my chest finally started to ease. That night, back home, I unpacked my bag and found something I hadn't noticed before. A small, dirty piece of paper folded and wedged in one of the outer pockets. I opened it up carefully. It was a page from an old field notebook, damp and wrinkled, with writing that was almost faded out. The only words still readable were, "Stayed here for 2 nights. Something outside. I don't know who left it there or how long ago, but I haven't been back since." The next time I checked the property listing online, the cabin wasn't there anymore. Either it finally collapsed or someone tore it down. Whatever the case, I didn't need to know. All I knew was that out there, deep in those woods, someone or something had been using that place long before I showed up. Not something supernatural, just something human. And somehow that made it much worse. It was late October 2011 when I decided to take a week off and head up to an old cabin I'd rented near the edge of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I had found it online, a small wooden structure built sometime in the 1960s, surrounded by thick pine trees and sitting about 2 miles from the nearest paved road. I'd been working long shifts that year and just wanted quiet. No phones, no city noise, no people. Just stillness and a place to breathe for a while. The drive up there took most of the day. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt road that looked more like an old logging trail than anything else. My tires kicked up dust and small stones, and the forest felt so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. I remember how the air changed colder, sharper, and there was that faint smell of wet leaves and bark. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected, but solid. The wood was dark from age and weather, and there was a short porch with a single rocking chair and an old lantern hanging beside the door. I parked next to a pile of chopped firewood, stepped out, and listened. There was no sound except a few distant birds and the faint rustle of trees swaying. The silence was almost too heavy. I unlocked the door and went inside. The air inside was cool, carrying that dry wooden smell that old cabins have. The place had one main room with a small kitchen on one side, a fireplace in the middle, and a door leading to a tiny bedroom in the back. There was also a narrow staircase going up to a small loft with a mattress. Everything looked fine, simple but livable. I set my bags down, started a fire, and unpacked my food and a few tools I'd brought. The power worked, but the lights flickered weakly, and there was no phone signal. I told myself that was part of the reason I came out there anyway. By sunset, the forest was already turning dark. I sat outside on the porch, eating chili from a pot, and just watched the trees. The air was so still that I could hear the creaking of the wood beneath me every time I shifted. The cabin lights glowed faintly through the small windows, and when night fully settled, the forest became a black wall. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down, and the room was dimly lit by the last bits of red glow. Then I heard it, a slow crunching sound outside, like footsteps, but dragging a little, as if someone was moving carefully over leaves. It came from the direction of the trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I sat still and listened, thinking it might be an animal. The steps stopped after a few seconds. I waited, nothing else, just that deep silence again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I threw another log into the fire and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside. The air was foggy and damp, and the ground was covered with wet leaves. I walked around the side of the cabin and saw faint marks in the dirt. They looked like footprints but not clear, more like someone stepped lightly or only half pressed into the ground. I crouched down, touched the dirt, and noticed something else. There was an empty beer can a few feet from the steps, half buried under leaves. I hadn't brought any beer. I didn't think much of it then. Maybe a hunter had passed by before. Still, I felt uneasy. I walked down the trail behind the cabin, which led to a small creek about a quarter mile away. There was an old metal chair by the water and a rusted bucket. It looked like someone used to fish there years ago. The area felt quiet, but not peaceful, more like it was holding its breath. Later that day, I chopped wood and cleaned the inside of the cabin. I tried to keep busy, but every few hours, I had that sense that I wasn't alone out there. It wasn't a clear feeling, just a kind of pressure, like being watched from behind trees you can't see through. That night, it rained. The sound on the roof was steady and heavy. I sat by the fire with a book for a while, then went to bed early. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up again. This time, there was no sound outside because of the rain, but I noticed something different. The door. It was open. Not much, just a few inches, enough to let a cold draft come in. I was sure I had locked it before sleeping. I got up slowly, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my chest. The rain had stopped, and I could see the outline of the trees through the open space. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and walked toward the door. The light beam hit the porch, the wet boards shining faintly. Then I saw it, a muddy boot print just inside the threshold. It was fresh. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at that single mark. Eventually, I shut the door and pushed the small wooden table against it. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, I packed some of my things into the truck. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I wanted to be ready to leave early if anything else happened. The ground outside was soft from the rain, and I followed the faint trail leading toward the trees. There were prints there too, faint but visible, boot prints going around the side of the cabin and disappearing into the woods. Whoever had been there had walked around the place. I followed the tracks for a few minutes until they vanished into a patch of leaves. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No birds, no insects, just that dead stillness. I turned back. That last night, I kept the fire burning bright. I stayed up, sitting near the window trying to listen. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, that same slow crunching sound, but closer this time. It circled the cabin once, stopping near the back wall. I held my breath. Then came the sound of something scraping lightly against the wood. Maybe a hand or a stick dragged slowly across it. The sound stopped after a minute, and everything went silent again. I waited until morning before moving. When the first light came through the trees, I stepped outside. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I walked around to the back wall where I had heard the scraping. The wood there had long, thin marks, almost parallel, like someone had run the edge of a knife or metal object across it. Near the bottom of the wall, I saw a single nail sticking out with a piece of old, frayed cloth hanging from it. It was damp and torn, looked like part of a jacket sleeve. I didn't wait any longer. I loaded my truck, locked the cabin, and drove out of there. When I reached the main road, I stopped for gas at a small station about 20 miles away. The man there told me something that stuck in my head for a long time. He said that about a year before, a man had been living out there in the woods. A drifter who refused to leave after the land was sold to new owners. They found his camp a few miles from where I'd stayed. No one ever saw him again after that winter. When I got home, I unpacked and tried to shake it off. But for weeks I couldn't stop thinking about that open door, the muddy print, and the scraping sound. I even checked the news later. Nothing ever came up. No reports, no missing person updates, nothing. Sometimes, late at night, I still remember how quiet those woods were, how heavy that silence felt, and how it seemed like the forest was watching me the whole time. I never went back to that cabin. I never even looked for another one. That place still sits out there somewhere, surrounded by trees, its walls still marked by that strange scraping, and maybe, just maybe, someone's still out there walking the woods around it. Slow, careful, waiting for another light to show through the window again.